Mm-hmm.
All right, letting people in. Hi, everybody. We're just going to take a couple minutes, make sure everybody gets in. We have a big group today. We have about 42 people who are signed up. So it'll just take a couple minutes for me to get everybody out of the wait room. As you come in, your screens are on, but you are muted. If anybody could just give me a hand wave or a thumbs up or put in the chat that you're able to hear us, that would be greatly appreciated. Awesome, thank you. As I mentioned earlier, we are recording today's session. Other sessions that were previously recorded are up already on YouTube. The best way to follow those is actually go to our YouTube channel, which was listed in the last email that I sent. And you can actually follow us. You'll get an email every time we post a new video. So right now we're using AI assisted closed captioning. You can turn that on or off by pressing the CC button that is at the top or bottom of your screen, depending on your device. We'll accept questions throughout the duration of the program. Arthur will also stop a couple times, see if there are any questions, and we'll have ample time at the end of the program to get through all of those questions, comments, stories, anything that you'd like to share. If you do not feel comfortable doing that on video because we're recording, just put those in the chat and I will read those questions for you. The chat is recorded separately and we do not post that publicly anywhere. You can also DM just me so I can see those questions. My name is Lauren Obach. I'm your moderator today, and this program is co-sponsored by the Friends of the Library and the Monroe Historical Society. Both groups during the month of December are doing special things. The Friends are having a half-price book sale throughout the entire month. Monroe Historical Society is hosting their Christmas fair on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. So please go check out those two events, stock up on any gifts, anything that you want for yourself. Today is session 3 of 7 in our Civil War series. Today's topic is the agrarian, industrialized North versus the agrarian South. In 2 weeks, on December 15th, we'll be hosting session 4, Blacks and the Civil War. I'm happy now to introduce Arthur Gottlieb. This is his 3rd series he has done with us, as well as some solo projects he's worked with us on. He's a local historian on political and military history and has an extensive background working with veterans, including during his time as the technical director of exhibits at the Intrepid and as a certified senior advisor and counselor. He was also in the Coast Guard for 17 years in Long Island Sound North. Welcome, Arthur.
Hi, everyone. I just want to start off by asking if anybody had any questions this far. We covered an awful lot of material last time and on the first time, and I've tried to make it as rich as I can as far as context is concerned. So if there's any questions that you have coming up about, geez, I always wondered about this, or I always wondered about that, or, please go further into something you've already talked about. Please don't hesitate to let me know. And if I can clarify something as we go along, then that's going to help you build information on top of what I've already said, kind of like rereading something, if you will. And so with that, does anybody have anything that you want me to review that we've discussed already? We talked about it during the introduction. I gave you an overview of what I wanted to cover and why. And last time, the significance of Abraham Lincoln and the election of 1860 as a turning point, as a provocation for the South to actually feel as though they had been attacked politically and philosophically, and therefore requiring a secession from the Union. first slowly and then all of a sudden, everybody. So do we have any comments so far?
Is everybody able to see that chat that I just put up? Did it pop up for anybody? Yeah, okay. We got one person last time who said they were not able to use the chat. So I don't know. People were chatting with me in the beginning of that session. So I don't know if we lost it halfway through, but I just want to be sure that it's working for everybody now.
Okay.
We also had a chat come in last time about we weren't sure what the raise hand feature was. That's at the top or bottom of your screen under reactions where you can raise your hand. So I know that you have a question. You can give us a thumbs up. You can clap for us if you want to. You cannot give us a thumbs down even if you want to, but you can raise that hand and we'll know that you have a question.
Yeah, we're just hammering this a little bit extra today because, you know, if in fact people couldn't actually participate last time, that's not something that we want to happen. So whenever I have a chance where I'm asking people, does anybody have any questions? Anybody have any comments? Especially after I've been talking for an hour and nobody has anything to say, it's either, I guess I'm doing a good job at what I set out to do, or I literally put everyone asleep. So, so anyway, today's program is, I called it the industrialized North versus the agrarian South. And these are all just generalized categories when I make these things up. Of course, the disparity in power and resources between the North, as is well known, and the South is really marked. The North had literally 5-6 times the industrial capacity, at least, as did the South. It had the majority of the railroad networks, the North. It had many other institutions that had already been trading with foreign nations. And this becomes important as far as how other nations viewed the American Civil War. This was a very important thing. The North had many significant advantages. Yet the South was able to really put up a pretty darn good fight. And the overall question I have today is, did the North win the war because of its overwhelming resources, men and material, etc., advantages diplomatically, politically, monetarily? Or did the North win for other reasons? Right? There's two ways of looking at it. Did the North win because of those resources that I just mentioned? Or did the South lose? Right? Now, this may sound like a matter of semantics, but it really isn't. The way that the Civil War has been reported on, discussed, memorialized, really goes along these lines. I mean, if you're a Southerner and you believed in the Southern cause, then it's kind of a hard nut to crack that you lost the war because you weren't as good of a fighter, or you were maybe fighting for the wrong things. You see, you know, most of the books that were written, certainly by Southerners about the South, was that the North, because of its overwhelming resources, literally overpowered the South. I mean, even General Lee, in his discussion to his own troops at the end of the war, was saying to the Southern soldiers to lay down their arms because we have been forced to submit to this overwhelming force of men and material. You see, so this is very, very important for historical context, looking at, you know, in memory of the American Civil War. Did the South lose because simply they were overwhelmed by the North? Or did the South lose because, philosophically speaking, their cause was not as sound as the cause in the North? What was the cause in the North for the Civil War? Was it originally, as we have discussed, solely to restore the Union, which means that the North wanting to restore the Union was greater than the cause of the South wanting to secede from the Union? And then later on, especially after 1863, the war becomes about the emancipation of slaves in a larger sense. So was the war won because the moral purpose of the war to end slavery once and for all in the United States was greater than the South's cause of wanting to preserve slavery? And these things are very, very important. You know, warfare is something, whatever era it is fought in, today or back in the American Civil War, doesn't matter what kind of technology you have, the war is still fought by people and supported politically by the constituents of politicians. Okay, so as long as the constituents of politicians believe in what you're doing, then the politicians will be enacting legislation and approval for things like war. And if the people don't want it anymore, then the politicians are going to have to vote against it or not support it. And these are very, very important things. And we saw that when the American Civil War, I mean, rather the American Revolutionary War. And we saw that also with the Vietnam War, right? Which is a good example because, you know, probably everyone in our audience today, certainly myself, remembers this. And you see that the American public support for the war, the Vietnam War, had diminished considerably, and those who were involved with it, certainly certainly at the time disgraced Richard Nixon by 1973. I mean, nobody wanted to have anything to do with it, or the people who had anything to do with it, you know, which put soldiers in a tough spot because it wasn't soldiers' fault. Yet, if you're like me, you remember soldiers being treated in a disrespectful manner because they went and they didn't flee, I guess, to Canada or something like that. And but the Revolutionary War, for instance, it's not that Great Britain was defeated militarily. I mean, Great Britain could have come over here and they could have absolutely crushed us, even with the French involvement. But the British made a decision that it literally wasn't worth further conflict, right? In other words, holding on to the British North American colonies just wasn't worth it. It just wasn't worth it. And these are the things that eventually cause wars to end in these fashions. And the Vietnam War, for instance, as I was just alluding to, I mean, public support was such that the American public had decided that it just wasn't worth it anymore. And that the people who were in authority in the United States at that time, in the 1960s, had lost credibility about their arguments about why you should keep it going. So the Americans were like, we're out of here. All right. And then you could talk about in maybe 10 years, we'll be talking about Afghanistan. I could do a presentation on it now, but you know, there are similar arguments, probably not as pronounced politically as the war in Vietnam. So the United States chose to leave. It just wasn't worth it anymore. Anything that we had hoped to gain, it was decided in that war, the Vietnam War, simply wasn't worth further bloodshed, money expended, bodies coming home in aluminum coffins. And so there you have it. So the underdog, the North Vietnamese, as it were, even though they were supplied heavily by the Chinese and the Russians, all they had to do was make it expensive enough for the United States, for public opinion to flip. And then we would go away. And then by default, the underdog wins. This is very, very important concept. Very important, because the same exact concept applies here in the American Civil War. You had an overdog and an underdog. And the underdog, of course, because of their size, of their population, manufacturing ability, and other resources, was relatively small compared to the North, as we were just discussing. They were the underdog. And we know that even though a country like the Union had greater resources, it doesn't mean that you're going to win, because this all boils down to what public opinion will support or not support. This is very important. In the North, the American public was begrudgingly going along with the American Civil War. Nobody wants to see people not coming home, dying by the tens of thousands. And that's what we had in the Civil War. So after a year, or after 2 years, after 3 years, after 4 years, everyone knows somebody who has been affected by this war. And people in the North were saying to themselves, is this really worth it? Did we support this to begin with? The people who say that they're winning, are they winning? Okay, are the General McClellans and the General Grants, are they just like the Robert McNamara's and the General Westmorelands? Just give us more troops, just give us more time, victories around the corner. The dynamics are exactly the same. And last time we spent a lot of time talking about how important the election of 1860 was, right? And there's a bookend to the election of 1860. The other bookend is the election of 1864. In warfare and politics, these electoral points are very, very important, especially if you're fighting the United States. Okay, and the South, of course, was fighting the United States, and so were other adversaries across time. Okay, there are things that Joseph Stalin did to provoke the United States to put Harry Truman in a tough spot when he was running for re-election on his own right. That if Harry Truman was going to change what he was going to do in foreign policy because he didn't want to risk losing the election. You see, there are a million examples of this. And we're particularly vulnerable because our presidency is up for re-election or election every 4 years. You see, so every 4 years, you have a chance to literally create havoc with whoever's running for office, and forcing them to do things that they may not have wanted to do, because they don't want to lose the election. Now, the Confederate States of America, by the way, Jefferson Davis and that presidency, the election there was 6 years. The term of the presidency was 6 years. So Jefferson Davis wasn't up for re-election in 1864, but Abraham Lincoln was. And he is all in about this war that has cost so much. So if something didn't happen to turn the tide, to give the American public, the Union public, the message that the war was being won, Abraham Lincoln's going to get tossed in the election. And then the the opposite candidate, McClellan of all people, who was somebody that actually Lincoln sacked as his general, right? You might say that he had an axe to grind, but let's not say that McClellan was ready to dump the entire country because he had a problem with Lincoln. McClellan's point of view was that it's not really worth continuing the war. Okay, now McClellan had his own caveats with that, and McClellan was only going to allow the southern states back into the Union if they made slavery illegal, but he was willing to end the war, basically in a negotiated peace. Who knows what would have happened with all of these what ifs, right? We could spend a month of Sundays discussing the what ifs of the world. But with Lincoln, he had the equivalent of unconditional surrender. All right, everything that the South was fighting for, they weren't going to get if Lincoln was reelected. And Lincoln wasn't going to get reelected unless something to the Union populace made it seem as though that Lincoln and his generals had the correct policy for the Confederate States of America. Now, for the average person, even back in those days, remember, we didn't have all of the kind of electronic media we have in talking heads 24/7. And it took a while for people to get information. They're not interested in technical nuances about who's winning and who's losing. What people want, and this is a simple matter of psychology and sociology, you look at some big battle and you say, we won, we lost. And there weren't a lot of those that we won or we lost. I mean, there were a few here and there. But it seemed like General Lee of the Confederate States of America was really kicking our butts in a lot of respect. So it wasn't really looking good for all of the expenditure of men and material and the overwhelming advantage that we went to war with from the North. It would seem like it's being mishandled. Something had to happen or Lincoln wasn't going to be reelected in 1864. And a lot of people were watching this. Not only was the South obviously watching this, and they hoped to create a war of attrition long enough to make Lincoln as unpopular as possible so he wouldn't get reelected, and you'd have a better chance with presumably McClellan, whatever would happen. And also, European countries are watching to see what's going to happen in the election of 1864 also. Now, in 1862, December, going into 1863, Abraham Lincoln puts forth something called the Emancipation Proclamation. And we'll be talking more about this in our next section that I've labeled Blacks in the Civil War. The Emancipation Proclamation changed the politics of everything. Let's use the Revolutionary War as an example once again. You can ask yourself the question of, would the United States actually prevailed? Well, not the United States, but the British North American colonies in rebellion of England, had we not been recognized by France, right? Now, once you're recognized by France, I guess you could call yourself the United States of America. Other than that, it's just, you're standing on top of a box declaring that you are somebody different than everybody else says you are, right? So if France didn't actually support us, would we have won the Revolutionary War? So you can see that this kind of support is essential. If Harry Truman, once again, did not recognize the state of Israel in 1948, would Israel have survived? And I think that probably in both of those cases, the answer would be no. You see, so the England and France, even Spain to a degree, which had been kicked out of British North America, not England, but certainly France and Spain would like nothing more than to have a foot back in. And the way that they would have a foot back in to this continent would be by aligning themselves with the Confederate States of America, which means that they would actually say that we recognize the Confederate States of America as a sovereign nation, separated from the United States of America. That would have changed everything. That would have changed the financing, that would have changed the supplies, that would have changed the war. The United States would have had to fought off whoever was coming over to supply the Confederate States of America, so that we would have a war on two fronts, literally. And I don't think that the Union really was in a position to do anything like that. If those were the situation, I mean, the South may very well have successfully broken away and consolidated their independence. But that didn't happen because the other countries were hedging their bets. They didn't want to bet on a losing proposition. Now, I said that the Emancipation Proclamation changed all the politics of this. And this is a simple reason. The Emancipation Proclamation put forward in the form of two executive orders by Abraham Lincoln. Two executive orders said, in summary, that for the southern states that were in a state of rebellion, remember, not only the states, there was something called border states, which were technically part of the South that hadn't succeeded, you see. Not succeeded, seceded. The southern states were affected by the Emancipation Proclamation in this way. The Emancipation Proclamation said that slaves in the states that were in a state of rebellion were henceforward liberated, emancipated, if you will. But now that had a tremendous effect, obviously, on the morale of everyone concerned. Now, if you're a slave in the southern states, the ones that had seceded, and you now have the prospect of something called freedom, are you going to be working as hard in the munitions factory or in the field to support the Confederate cause? Probably not. And that's exactly what happened. So what happened was you had more people who could have been part of the Confederate military or the direct Confederate war effort that had to be bled off to be back on the farm or back in the factory to actually deal with people who were, shall we say, not working as hard as they should be, or even being saboteurs. You see, and that was just an immediate effect of the Emancipation Proclamation. But what about the politics? Well, in the specific case of France and Great Britain, France and Great Britain had already outlawed slavery, right? They had already done away with it. So now that the Emancipation Proclamation put slavery front and center in the cause of the Civil War, really it was an ancillary thing, but it became front and center and took over as the moral backbone to the cause against the Confederate States of America. Now, politically, optically, France or England could not align themselves with a country, the Confederate States of America, that were fighting for something that they had already deemed morally reprehensible, slavery. So the Emancipation Proclamation automatically flipped the politics internationally of the American Civil War and made it so that France or England couldn't align themselves with the Confederate States of America. It was the Union, it was the United States of America, which was on the correct moral side now, the side that France and Britain had already chosen. You see, so they couldn't align themselves with the Confederate States of America now, lest they be like these major hypocrites. And that's really just that simple. And that one thing about nobody recognizing the Confederate States of America, not officially anyway. I mean, there was a lot of trade going on and a lot of contraband, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And there was money to be made in any kind of a gray area, right? Anytime you've got chaos, there's money to be made. History's shown us anything. But not officially, no official recognition for the Confederate States of America. And that alone bolstered the prospects of the Union and dealt another morale blow to the for the Southerners. Very important stuff. Remember, everything runs on what the country is going to support or not support as far as the actual person is concerned and how the person interprets these things. You know, from an academic standpoint, this is a mistake that is made all the time, in my opinion. In academics, certainly today, is that you have academic point of view and you have little understanding of what actually makes sense to average people. But if you can't make things make sense to average people, you are inherently condescending to them. And people don't like to be condescended to, do they? And so unless you want to have a society where you have the elite and then you have the lower class where it's just accepted that you neither are worthy of making decisions for yourself, but don't think that anybody could allow you to make decisions for yourself, right? So we have a situation now where the North has the ability to crush the South. Why is it taking so long? If the United States, right, has the ability to crush the South, why isn't the South crushed, right? Because of the vast money and materials and weaponry and supplies and railroad networks. Why isn't the South crushed? Somebody had something in the chat room.
Yes, the question is, I read that Lincoln never declared war against the CSA because that would legitimize them. Rather, he was quelling an insurrection rebellion. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I go for the latter. That's, you know, of course, the whole hope was that the strategy of the North was to get the South to decide that it wasn't worth it before the whole thing got going, right? Every war has a period like that. Okay, you had periods of time, even in World War II, right? You had this period of time between September 1939, where Poland was invaded, and when things got totally juiced in the spring of 1940. It was called like the phony war, right? And everybody's hoping against hope that, you know, maybe this is the period of time where Great Britain, if you've ever seen those movies with Churchill, where everyone's telling Churchill, listen, you just gotta, like, we can't fight the Germans, they're unstoppable, you know, and make a deal with Hitler. And Hitler is going to tell us that he's going to leave us alone if we don't interfere with Europe. You see what I mean? So, and the same thing here, there was a period of time right in 1868, leading into 1861, before the actual shooting started at Fort Sumter, where we were just going, we, the North, were going to try and come down and actually blockade the southern states so effectively that the major trade routes out of the Mississippi were going to become ineffective as trade routes. And it would essentially just portend so badly for the South that they would just say, well, we can't win if we're completely blockaded. You see, so there was this little phony war aspect of it. And there's always the hope that if you appease your opponent, they will come to their senses. Right? If you appease your opponent, even in any kind of negotiation with an adversary, if this is something that we tried to do so many different ways. All throughout the Vietnam War, we wanted to hit the North Vietnamese, but we didn't want to hit them in a fatal way, because then they would be like, oh, well, now we've been terribly attacked. We thought that we could actually send them a message that we could hit them if we wanted to, and kill them, all of them, if we wanted to. But we're not, because we want to negotiate with you, right? So the message is that, yeah, we could kill you if we want to, but we're not, because we want you to recognize that we're being generous, so you could come forward and negotiate with us. You see, so there's always that hope against hope. And we were trying to strangle the South through a monetary and trade blockade with the United States Navy, of which we had, massive superiority over the South. And in many cases, the South went into a guerrilla warfare state. So Lincoln didn't want to antagonize the South any more than he needed to, and he didn't want to legitimize them either. If the Confederate States of America was recognized by the United States, then essentially, from a psychological point, have they not achieved what they wanted to achieve? You see, a lot of psychological warfare in these things, very subtle. So if you are a lesser force, how do you counter a larger force, right? And this applies to the American Civil War as well as it applies to 100 other lessons throughout military history. You see, let me give you another example. In World War I, there was a brand new naval technology called the submarine, right? And it was a rudimentary kind of a thing. If you went down in the submarine with 50 guys, I mean, like, maybe you'd come back to the surface and maybe you wouldn't, maybe your torpedo would run properly, or maybe it wouldn't. And maybe you would all asphyxiate, or maybe you wouldn't. You see, but the larger navies, right, the British Navy, in this particular example I'm going to use, which was the largest in the world and considerable, the most formidable military force on the entire planet, had blockaded, this is World War I, had blockaded all of the seagoing lanes to Germany. Germany is a landlocked country, essentially, except through around the Denmark Strait. So the British Navy had completely boxed in the Germans. The Germans had actually built a pretty significant fleet. And the only thing that the German fleet could do, though, because they were hemmed in by the British Navy, is come out for some fast raids. And as soon as they would come out, then the British Navy would chase them, you see. But what the Germans wanted to do to stop the British from having the power to fight the war, what the British wanted to do, what the Germans wanted to do is sink all of the ships coming across the North Atlantic, supplying Great Britain, who could prosecute the war against Germany. But how do you get out to the Atlantic to sink those ships? Well, you can't. Not with ships, because the British had them blockaded in. So the Germans actually started to use these small coastal defense boats. Really, that's what submarines were for. They were only for the defense of your coast. You see, they started using them for offensive warfare because they were forced to. So in the form of underwater guerrilla warfare, the lesser power in this case, the German Navy, submerged, went out past the British Isles, and then started sinking all kinds of ships with their submarines, which was something that was never really envisioned for submarines. The Germans invented this method of warfare because they had to, because they were the underdogs, because they were forced to break the blockade. And the Confederate States of America were in the same exact position, not only with their Navy, but with their Army too. They had lesser of a force, which forced them to be very, very careful about how to neutralize the advantages that the North had. How do you neutralize the greater force? Well, first of all, in warfare, whether it's a civil war or anywhere else, right? And remember, this is in the days before airplanes and aerial reconnaissance and radio communications and radar and all the rest of that, okay? The force that is defending something has an advantage over an attacking force, because the defending force is static, essentially, and therefore can see what the offensive force is going to do, and then maneuver their positions around to counter the offensive thrust. Those who are attacking have the burden to break the defensive line. And the defensive line is already dug in. You see? So the South automatically has that strategy, because for the South to win, as I was talking about, they don't have to conquer the North. They don't have to defeat the Army of the Potomac. They only have to prevail until the North decides it's not worth it anymore, which is a point that I tried to make already. You see? So the South can afford to be on the defensive, and what the South needed to do, which they became experts at under General Lee and others, is actually being able to retreat from situations where they were losing, rapidly retreat to another defensive line, reconstitute their forces, and then actually attack or counterattack. You see, so the power of retreat is very, very powerful, right? And that is something that the South really neutralized the larger Northern forces, because it was incumbent upon the North to essentially invade the South, you see? And once again, it has to do with public perception. Now, there were two occasions where General Lee actually went north into Pennsylvania, Gettysburg being one of them, where General Lee was trying to actually change public perception of the war in the North by showing the North that after 2-3 years of battle, that the South still had the capacity to not only defend itself, but actually attack a northern state. You see, now that was supposed to be a morale breaker. Case in point, the Tet Offensive in 1968. The Tet Offensive was designed to do exactly the same thing, right, by the North Vietnamese. By attacking United States and South Vietnamese positions simultaneously, okay, at myriad locations. At that late stage of the war in 1968, it broke the back of America's confidence that the war was really being won. So after all of these years of fighting, after all of this money is spent, after all of these people are dead and sacrificed, you're telling me at this late stage, the North Vietnamese still have the ability to kick our butts in 12 separate locations in an organized fashion like that? Now, the Tet Offensive was a massive military failure for the North Vietnamese, but it didn't matter because it succeeded in its objective of changing public opinion in America against the war. That's what Lee's forays into the North were designed to do. So it's amazing how it doesn't matter what time frame you're talking about, the same elements of strategy and psychology are precisely the same. Keep in mind also that the generals in the North and the generals in the South, I mean, Grant and Lee being two prime examples, were both trained in the same damn place, West Point. You see, they had even fought up until the Civil War on the same side, so they were both sides officers were both educated in a similar fashion. So, you know, if we were doing something today, we would have all of these different wars to look back on if that's what you're doing, and I hope that's what's being taught in war colleges. So what were the kind of lessons that the people in Grant's day or Lee's day, what were they studying as far as maneuver warfare, et cetera? And that would have been the Napoleonic Wars, right? And the Napoleonic Wars. And this is before the internal combustion engine, it's before tanks, it's before trucks and motor vehicles, it's before these rickety airplanes they had flying around, it's before dirigibles, it's before aerial reconnaissance, right? So what you had was land warfare. And the element of surprise, the element of maneuver, the element of deception, you see, that's what you had. And that's what the Civil War was fought on. Now, the Civil War was like right in between the Revolutionary War, right, as far as technology was concerned, and something like World War I, right? In a lot of ways, World War I was fought like the Civil War was, with just much more horrible weapons. And not only that, but World War I was remarkably changed in the standpoint by the fact that you had the internal combustion engine, right? The petrol engine, or the paraffin engine in some cases, right? So which now made it possible to have mechanized warfare, trucks, motor vehicles, tanks in their most rudimentary form, and of course, aircraft, right? Aircraft were used for reconnaissance first, right? So if you could fly over, imagine if the people in the Civil War could fly over the enemy and see what they were up to. Whoa, they're over here. They're amassing on top of the hill. They're trying to outflank us over here. It was really the exact same thing in World War I. And that's what the airplanes were used for. The reason why people started putting guns on airplanes was that if your opponent is flying over your garrison force, your trenches, you don't want them having all of that information, that strategic information. So you start putting up airplanes with machine guns to shoot down the other side's reconnaissance airplanes. And then the other side responds by putting their own machine guns on their airplanes, and then they flying two airplanes now, one with the machine guns and one with the camera. You see? So while the guy's taking pictures, the other guy's there to now shoot at you. So you put up two airplanes to their two airplanes. That's how that got started. It was really just about reconnaissance, the ability to reconnoiter, right? Because intelligence is everything. In World War II, we had a different version of it because we were breaking codes, right? So we had information that the enemy didn't think we had, et cetera. Although with the aircraft, I guess you can hear and see them, so you know they're looking at you, right? Now, the railroads were an absolute game changer in the way that the aircraft was, and the internal combustion engine in World War I. In the days of the Civil War, you had two things. You had the railroads and you had the telegraph, and it changed warfare. It changed warfare completely. Jefferson Davis in Richmond was communicating with his generals in real time, literally, by telegraph, as was Abraham Lincoln communicating with his subordinate generals in real time via telegraph. The whole communication center set up in the White House, etc. You see, so this is something that was never, never existed before. And the railroads literally dictated where armies could be and where they couldn't be. Because when the North, for instance, came down into the South, you had to literally not only have your offensive force coming into the South, but you had to protect the railroads that were behind you, because the further into country you went, the further away from your supply lines you were. So then all your enemy had to do, all General Lee had to do, was outflank you and go around the back of your army and cut off your supply of material. And then you were a sitting duck. You see, no more ammunition, no more food, and no ammunition and no food. You're basically screwed. You see, so that's another advantage that the incumbent has, right? Those who are in their own home territory, call it a home force advantage. You see what I mean? You know where you're in your country right now, and they're invading you. So if you cut off the supply lines of those who are invading you, then essentially they're out of spare parts, they're out of cannons, they're out of bullets, they're out of cannonballs, they're out of uniforms, they're out of salt pork or whatever the hell they ate, and they're out of all of those things. You see, at this stage of the war, it wasn't what got changed in what I'm going to talk to you about in session 6, from Atlanta to Appomattox, in which we'll talk about how General Sherman, William Tecumseh Sherman, changed the nature of warfare forever by being the first modern general, in this sense, in bringing something to us in an age of chivalry, something called total war. You see, and what I mean by the logistics involved was that right at this point, the Civil War soldiers coming down from the North weren't going to ransack a city and steal everything there to support themselves. They wanted to be self-supporting as far as the railroads coming down. And don't forget, when you're coming down into Southern territory, you're using Southern railroads now. You see, you're using Southern railroads. So the further into enemy territory you get, the more forces you have to use to watch and guard your rear, so you don't get cut off from behind and isolated. You see, so this is another thing that actually balanced out the fact that the North had more stuff and more people. You see, any questions so far? To understand this gives you an understanding in a lot of things. World War II in Europe, for instance, is replete with examples of logistical supply trains and the reasons why battles are fought for the matter of logistics. The entire Battle of the Bulge was fought over logistics, okay? That we needed a port to bring materials and supplies closer to the advancing Western Allies armies, i.e. General Bernard Montgomery and Patton, now that we were at the frontier of Germany in December 1944, okay? And that new port was going to be a place called Antwerp, you see, because we were still bringing stuff in from the Khotan Peninsula all the way back on the English Channel. You see, so we had these very long supply trains, and oftentimes somebody like Patton had to stop because it's literally, he outran his supplies, certainly his gasoline, in his mechanized army, right? So these things are paramount. We're usually thinking about warfare in terms of, people who are flying airplanes or doing something dramatic in a ship or some kind of a land vehicle or even a soldier, but really the whole thing marches on logistics, the entire thing. So the Confederates are using guerrilla warfare which was another thing. I guess the best example would be, North Vietnamese as far as guerrilla warfare. And the North had to resort to its own versions of guerrilla warfare. And this is a riverine war in the Civil War. Another similarity to Vietnam, right? We had two big riverine wars in the United States military. It was the American Civil War, and it was Vietnam, right? Where we're using rivers to go into often hostile territory to bring up supplies for communication routes and all the rest of that. And the American Civil War was certainly a great example of that. We're going to talk about that when I talk about session 5, the war fought on rivers and seas. All right. Now, the North had a draft, right? And the South had a draft. The South drafted its soldiers before the North did. But anytime you have a draft, it creates resentment amongst the population that you're being drafted into this thing, you see? And initially, certainly in the South, there were so many people running to enlist because this was going to be a glorious war, and it was going to be over in, who knows, less than a year. And how can you be left out of it, right? This is something where you didn't want to be in a situation where your grandkids were going to ask you what you did in the Great War of Independence for the Confederacy, and you would be like, well, I was here milking cows. No, you wanted to be there on the back of a horse fighting damn Yankees. You see, so initially everybody wanted to be a part of it. Then, of course, when it dragged on and it dragged on and it dragged on, then it was a tremendous amount of attrition of soldiers and men. It became a different thing, and you imagine, like, I was never actually, the draft for me ended, I don't know, in, what was it, 1973? I graduated from high school in 1975, you see, so. And my older brother had a deferment because he was in college. So, but drafts create resentments amongst the population, which is the voting public, right? And also homeland hardships, right? The South by 1863, I mean, talk about skyrocketing inflation. I mean, you couldn't buy a loaf of bread. I mean, coffee, all of these things were luxuries. Maybe you had a farm and you could eat off of that, but everything was going for the war effort. And, there's people tire of this. Not everybody is a dyed-in-the-wool advocate for the cause. Most people in warfare are innocent bystanders. They're innocent bystanders. I mean, how many people in the North didn't want any part of this whole thing called the Civil War? And how many people in the South didn't want any part of this whole thing called the Civil War? I mean, if you live in an agrarian place, I mean, and even in the North back in those days, you had your pockets of urban centers, right? But most of the place, I mean, right around here in Connecticut, certainly, I mean, most people were kind of citizen farmers, if you will. And, it's hard work. I've never lived on a farm or operated a farming equipment or anything else like that, but I understand it's difficult work. And without all of these kind of modern, technology and and fertilizers and things, that you would stand a chance of working for a year for nothing if something befell your crop, you see? And, do you have the time for politics and all the rest of this? And I remind you that even people in the North, you may not actually have said, well, I believe in slavery, but you weren't crazy about Black people either. Right? Nobody in the North, except for these very enlightened people who were part of the abolitionist movement, felt that, well, maybe Blacks shouldn't be enslaved, but I don't think they should actually be my equal either, right? So we've got to put that in context as far as the will to fight on the part of the North, right? Not everybody is thinking about things like you and I may be today with our own senses of, morality and right and wrong from the standpoint of 2021. So as far as cost benefit is concerned, it's, we can look at that from the early 1930s also here in the United States, when you had already like these inklings coming out about this horrendous treatment of the Jews in the Third Reich, in the early 1930s, mid 1930s, there was a lot of people who were kind of like, well, I don't think, not that people knew about, death camps or anything, but people were like, well, I don't agree that the Jews should be exterminated, but, it wouldn't hurt me that bad if they were run out of town either, you see? And there was a lot of anti-Semitism here, okay, just to name one example out of 100 examples. And I'm just putting that forward because I'm trying to put this in context as far as what the thought process was and how it affects what you do or you don't do, right, as a society. So, trust in leadership. How long was the North going to trust Abraham Lincoln and these generals? Right, Abraham Lincoln was going nuts because he had, I used McClellan as an example before. The reason why McClellan was replaced was because McClellan, although he was a competent person, he wasn't giving what today we would call the correct optic that we needed to sustain the entire war, which was giving the North some red meat examples of we kicked their butt. You see, as I was saying to you before, there's only so much mumbo jumbo technical talk you can use to explain something away. And people know in their gut that, well, if you say we're winning, how come it doesn't seem like we're winning? And what would seem like we're winning? A decisive victory. Somebody who's going to go in there and not only keep the enemy from achieving their objective, but then chase the enemy until they're annihilated. Right now, nobody got annihilated in these battles of the Civil War, as far as skill is concerned, and as far as strategy is concerned, they were pretty well matched on the South and the North. The difference is that the North had more stuff to throw into it, right? But the North needed victories, and that is why Lincoln pulled Grant in, because Grant had proved himself in the Western theater of operations, right, over by the Mississippi, and Lincoln wanted somebody who was going to have some demonstrable victories, somebody who was going to chase Lee around and corner him and have some, well, the term would be a propaganda victory. And these things are just as important as they are now as they ever were then, and even before then. The only difference now is that everything happens in a New York second, if I can use that phrase, right? Well, the election of 1864, like I said, was the key to the whole thing. The South had to prevail, and they had to do enough damage, and they had to make it seem like they weren't anywhere near to being defeated, even if they were, almost defeated. They had to give the optic that they were still alive and well and capable of all kinds of destruction, just like the example I used of the North Vietnamese in tech. so that by 1864, people would elect out Abraham Lincoln, and then it would be a whole game changer. It would be a whole game changer. This kinds of gambles and this kind of strategy is used in warfare all the time. In the beginning of World War II in the Pacific, right? As you know, the United States is attacked by Japan on December 7th, 1941, right? The head admiral, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, knows that he can keep the US Navy in the Pacific occupied and running around for approximately a year. That was it. After that, he knew that the industrial might of the United States was going to bring numbers to bear in the Pacific and elsewhere, to the point where logistically the Japanese were going to lose, even if the Japanese were better, which they were. Okay, as far as material and nighttime strategy, we overcame that with technologies like radar, et cetera, but mostly numbers. And and Yamamoto knew that. And what he was hoping for, and what the strategy was in the Pacific in World War II for the Japanese, was to knock us out in a devastating blow at Pearl Harbor, have the United States think about the prospect of being in war in Europe, which everybody knew we were already leaning towards heavily, and facing the prospect of an entire war in the Pacific too. And the Japanese were hoping that the Americans would decide that it wasn't worth it. It wasn't worth the war in the Pacific for a handful of islands, for whatever, for Japan to be able to claim hegemony over what it should be, have hegemony over anyway, which was Asian countries, right? Sparking the end of, European colonialism. And the Japanese felt as though the United States was not going to have the gumption to literally fight two wars, one in Europe and one against the Japanese. And we would just kind of like sue for a negotiated peace in the Pacific. You see, but once again, psychology took over, sociology took over. And what the Japanese didn't bank on is that we felt so angry over being betrayed by them while negotiating for peace. They were behind our backs planning to stab us in the back, that we would want to seek their unconditional surrender, because that's how mad we were, you see. And that, of course, is what happened. And that changed the whole game. But you see, the point is that the underforce, Japan, which had a fraction of what the United States had, was going to do as much damage as possible and then go for a negotiated peace, right? And certainly by 1862, 1863, 1864, the South was looking for that negotiated peace. They were hoping that Lincoln would be out and that McClellan would be in, and they would have a negotiated peace of some sort. Okay, it would certainly be better than whatever was going to come from Lincoln being elected, reelected, and maintaining his stature as president of the United States. What do you think? Any thoughts, comments, questions, recipes? No.
Nothing in the chat. Sorry, my phone is ringing. Nothing in the chat, but if anybody has any questions that they want to pop in there, we can also, if you want to turn your screen on and your microphone on, you can ask a question that way too.
Yep. The important part of the war, which we're going to talk about in the campaign for Atlanta, okay, the next real phase was the determining factor that really what was keeping the South alive and making it possible for General Lee, especially, to be able to be strong in places like the northern southern states, right, like in Virginia, and still be a formidable threat to places like Washington, D.C., et cetera, was the fact that the Deep South at this point was still relatively untouched. You see, and why is that important? It's important because that is where the logistical supply was, right? If you look at a place like Atlanta, well, Atlanta was teeming, I mean, for a small place, which it was back in those days, it was teeming with tanneries of leather products, and you might consider, for instance, how important that was, leather. I mean, with horses and buggies and all of those accoutrements that you have of war and still have of war today, as far as accessories, whether for war or not. You had tanneries, and not only that, but the breadbasket of the South, as far as processing centers, where food was being processed, where meat was being butchered, where ammunition was being manufactured, where pistols and weapons and cannonballs and cannons and wagon wheels were being assembled and manufactured. That stuff was coming from the Deep South, in places in Georgia especially, and then going through these rail networks that were held intact by the Confederacy. So from 1863 on, there was a new strategy by General Grant, and that was specifically had to do with politics. And the politics was of the politics of the 1864 election. Something has to happen, and it has to happen in less than a year, or the cause is going to be lost politically. And that's what forced the change in strategy. So somebody that Grant had worked with before, and they got along together, was Grant and Sherman. Right, Sherman was somebody who had actually been accused of being insane at one point. And Grant had the reputation for being an alcoholic. And there's a famous quote from General Sherman that I didn't bother Grant about his drinking, and he didn't bother me about being crazy. Okay, that's an actual quote, by the way. And so Sherman was given the task of being in charge of the southern forces, right, of the Union Army. And now we were going to go down through Tennessee, through Kentucky, into Georgia proper, and then actually eliminate the source of supplies and food and the transportation network that was supplying Lee's army in Virginia. And once that was cut off and destroyed, then Lee's army would have now two enemies. It would have to deal with, militarily, it would have to deal with the Northern force, the Union Army, which was now under General Grant. And it would have to deal with its own survival and the fact that it was going to be in a constant scarcity of supplies and food, and that was the entire purpose of the southern phase of the war through Atlanta. And I'll talk about that in detail when we get to it. You see, so that literally changed the entire game plan, and it was highly effective because of Sherman, because of General Sherman. And that became probably one of the most controversial legacies of the war, that we had gone from this era of, well, like literal chivalry to what historians refer to as the first version of total war, right? A more recent example, of course, would be America's bomber effort from the 8th Air Force and the 15th Air Force flying into Germany from points in Great Britain, that would be the 8th Air Force, and points from Italy, that would be the 15th Air Force, flying into Germany to destroy the aircraft factories that the Germans had, the ball bearing factories, to target whatever they could target, to destroy the men, the materials, the factories, the logistics that made the war effort possible for the Germans. If you destroy the Germans' ability to make war, then their soldiers in the field are going to be facing two enemies. They're going to be facing either the Russians to the east or the Western allies to the west, but they're also going to be facing constant fuel shortages. They're also going to be facing constant food shortages, clothing shortages, ammunition shortages. It's the same exact thing. It's the same exact thing that was done. You see, so even though the North started off with all of these advantages, you can see by the actual way that war is fought and the fact that we had to go mostly into the South to do it, it neutralized a lot of the advantages we had. And, you know, there's another psychological one. I mean, when you're the underdog, there's a certain esprit de corps that goes along with that. You see, you know, because there's a lot of this crazy romanticism to it that goes along with these things. But because people are people, you know, you tend to be driven by things of the heart. In psychology and in my public teaching, you know, I'm constantly running into people who are acting like, well, that doesn't make sense. Why would somebody do that? Why? Because they're a person. And what's driving them is an emotional thing, and they're trying to maybe achieve some kind of strategic objective, you know, but ultimately, you know, you think with you act quite often with your heart, you know. It's like, you know, if you've ever walked into the voting booth, and I'm not saying that you did this, but you probably know what I'm talking about. It's kind of like, I don't know, maybe this guy would be better, but I just don't like him. You know, I just don't like him. I just don't like him. You know, and these things are very, very important. You know, ask yourself who you chose as a life partner. Okay, I mean, did you go with like some kind of a checkoff list, you know, and say, well, you know, here's this education and she looks like this, or he looks like that, or whatever. This is how much money they're going to be making in 10 years and all the rest of that. No, it was kind of like either you like the person, you don't like the person, you get along, you don't get along. Right. I know this, you know, I don't want to go out onto thin ice on this one, but you see what I'm getting at. People are people, you know, and at the end of the Sherman's campaign, the Atlanta campaign, right? People in the South, Southern soldiers, were deserting in droves. They were deserting in droves because after the Atlanta campaign, it became clear from the psychological warfare that Sherman wanted to achieve. In the same way that that General Lee wanted to attack the North for the psychological shock of saying, hey, we're the smaller force and you've been fighting us for years and we're still able to invade a northern state and challenge you. How does that feel? Sherman wanted to show the Southerners, yes, that's what's known as the March to the Sea. You had the Atlanta campaign, and then after the Atlanta campaign, then there was the March to the Sea, to Savannah. And then they shifted to the north and went up through Carolinas. Okay. And we'll get into that when we talk about the Atlantic. We talk about from Atlanta to Appomattox, all right? That's more figurative, from Atlanta to Appomattox, all right? General Sherman didn't go to Appomattox. Appomattox where the war ended, all right? And so Sherman wanted to give the South the psychological shock of being able to say that a Northern army, far from its supply lines in the North, could literally cut a 50-mile wide swath from Atlanta to the Atlantic Ocean, with the Southern army that's supposed to be protecting you not being able to do a damn thing about it. And it had its desired effect, because people in the South knew the war was lost. You see? So the North was able to flip that paradigm onto the South, and the North essentially lost its morale as a result of what Sherman did. You know, unless you were a diehard, you know what I mean? Unless you were a person who was, you know, it's kind of like using the example of the Germans again, of course. You know, you had people who were surrendering in, you know, late 1944, early 1945. You see, if you were German, but if you were a part of the SS and you were like a real dyed-in-the-wool Nazi, you'd rather be dead than surrender. You see, you know, so you have that in every hierarchy, no matter what that hierarchy is. You know, but the average people are kind of like, this is over, man. This is over. We've lost. So the South found itself in a situation in 1864 where its soldiers were deserting like crazy because it was a hopeless cause. Right? If you've ever seen Gone with the Wind, and I know you must have, if you haven't, it's worth watching. Just from I mean, I don't go for a lot of the, you know, the drama and all of that, you know, but it's, but the point for me is at the beginning of the war, what was that guy's name? Leslie Nielsen? No, not Leslie Nielsen. What am I thinking about? I was in a movie I saw the other day, Airplane 2. I'm sorry. Leslie Howard? No. You had people who thought that this was going to be a grand event. If you were going to be, you were going to be representing Southern values, right? And the highest level of Western civilization that the Western civilization has achieved, right? If you were a plantation owner or something like that, you essentially consider yourself to be the bearer of the legacy of all of the good things of Europe, but even better now that it's here in the New World. No, Red Butler was the other guy. And it wasn't Red Butler, it was Rhett Butler, R-H-E-T-T, okay? And that was Gable. Now I'm thinking of the other guy, the other love interest. And anyway, so you had the moral upper hand, and because you were so virtuous, you believe so much in your cause, right? You know, and remember, you had this, you know, this is the beginnings of what later was to become Darwinian theory, you know, that there were naturally people in nature, which are the winners, and naturally people in nature, which are the losers, right? Which occupied scientific thought for the later 19th century, early into the 20th century, right? And it was alive and well in the United States. Yeah, Leslie Howard, thank you. Anyway, so it wasn't that unusual for people in the South and a lot of people in the North to be like, well, you know, I've got these people who are working for me like indentured servants. Well, what's the problem? Because everybody knows that you've got the winners and you've got the losers, right? Not because of an economic thing, but from what later on we would refer to as a Darwinian thing. right? So if you believe in what later on was going to be the survival of the fittest, right? I mean, if you had two, I don't know, like when I was a kid, I used to watch, those wild nature stories and, Omaha's Wild Kingdom or whatever the hell it was called. You know what I'm talking about. The John Cameron Swayze guy and the watches and the advertisements. They had these, I don't know, two elks or something, these things with the little antlers, and they'd be bashing themselves, right? Because both of them wanted the one female. And the one who knocked out the other elk got the female and was able to procreate their genetic bloodline. You see what I mean? And who's to say that that's not the way nature works? You see, so I mean, obviously that's it. One lost, and that's the end of the bloodline, unless you find another female if you're not dead. Okay. And this one, because it was stronger or whatever it was, biological society, social Darwinism says that there are people who have succeeded in society and as a group because they must be superior to the other, right? And that's the way social Darwinism looked at, of course, and it's what in psychology we call it a rationalization, right? To serve our own prejudices, right? So women shouldn't be hanging around machinery because men are smarter in this regard, it's Darwinian, and Black people shouldn't be given something complicated to do or that much responsibility because they need to be taken care of and they're only good for like whatever mechanical labor, right? So that's the very heart of prejudice, but it was highly reinforced by what people felt was normal. And of course, white people assign themselves to be the bearers of that high society, you see. And all of that stuff was alive and well. And some people say it still is alive and well. But the Southerners believed in what they were doing. They believed in they had the moral upper hand. They were more inspired, and their inspiration was going to carry them. You see what I mean? One of the reasons why the Japanese in World War II thought that they would eventually prevail, right, was that they thought that the Westerners, the United States particularly, were so soft and selfish, and by our material abundance and the fact that we didn't care about anybody but ourselves and what the next automobile we were going to buy and creature comforts and all the rest of that the Japanese saw themselves in their code of honor, their code of Bushido, of self-sacrifice. They saw themselves superior to us morally and as far as having the will to fight. The Japanese didn't think we had the will to fight. And that was the biggest miscalculation that they made in World War II, you see. And the Southerners didn't think that the Northerners had the will to fight. From their own blind spot created from their own, I don't know, egocentrism, sense of superiority, sense of moral superiority, sense of purpose, you see? And these are the mistakes that are made in warfare by societies and militaries all day long, in the past, right up to the present, right up to the present. Yeah, the Atlanta campaign is going to be a good one for us. We were trying to split the Confederacy in two, right? In another thing, splitting the Confederacy in two basically meant that General Grant had to take a place called Vicksburg, which we eventually did, which was on the Mississippi. Now, if we had control of the Mississippi, right, which was the main highway through the South, North and South, it means that effectively we would have split the Western Southern states, right, from the rest of the Confederacy. Now, from a military standpoint, this didn't really matter that much, okay? But from a symbolic standpoint, once again, psychological warfare, it was very important that we had split the Confederacy in two, you see? And it's another thing that we did. So much of this relies on images of looking at something and it seems like we're winning or it seems like we're losing. And certainly splitting the Confederacy in two by having control of the Mississippi was one of those things. It was kind of like in World War II, to use a final example. When the Allied forces landed in D-Day on June 6, 1944, and the Patton is going across southern France, and Bernard Montgomery with the Canadians and the British were going across northern France. You see, it really, from a military standpoint of routing the Germans, if that's what you want to call it, out of France, and then over to Belgium and Luxembourg, over to the German frontier, where I was describing the Battle of the Bulge before. Was it necessary to stop and liberate Paris from a military perspective? No, it wasn't. It was completely symbolic. It was completely symbolic because it was going to bolster the morale of the Western allies, and I guess the Russians too, for that matter. And it was going to do a devastating blow to the morale of the Germans. So from that point, it is very necessary, and that's why that was done. It wasn't because Paris had to be liberated. It was when the French flag goes back up over Paris, it's obviously a sign that the Germans are on the run and they're going to lose the war, you see. And so from psychology standpoint, I mean, I just did a program on Mount Suribachi, not Mount Suribachi, rather Iwo Jima, of which the volcanic mountain on Iwo Jima is Mount Suribachi, right? And you have this handful of Americans, Marines, clambering up the side of Mount Suribachi to put this flag on top of Mount Suribachi, right? Now, is that something that they had to do? I mean, Mount Suribachi was still held by the Japanese at that point, and they were in active combat all the way up the side of the mountain. But once that flag went up, the morale boost on the part of Americans was incalculable, absolutely incalculable. You see, and it's just a flag, but it's more than that. So next time we're going to do Blacks in the Civil War, and of course that's a very important aspect of our overall program. And I'm going to talk about the Emancipation Proclamation. I'll talk about how Blacks got incorporated into the Northern forces, okay? And I'll talk about slaves and how they were trying to flee the South, et cetera, now that they had something of their own in it for them. And we'll get into all of that. And if anybody has any questions, furthermore, something they wanted to ask but thought of later or something, just send an email and it will be forwarded to me and I'll answer it in due time. Okay, guys?
Looks like we're all out of chat questions. If anybody thinks of anything, as Arthur said, shoot me an email and we will see everyone back here in 2 weeks. Have a good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much, Arthur.
Thanks for joining me. Bye-bye now.